This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode number 402, ECA. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about the ECA module with Jürgen Haas. Jürgen is a Drupal enthusiast since 2006 and an automation expert. He's passionate about security and privacy. Welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I'm Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development, and today my co-hosts are, as usual, John Picozzi, solution architect at EPAM.
Hello, everyone.
And we're just going to jump right into the main topic. Martin is off this week. He's traveling, so we're hoping he's enjoying his time off. So let's start with an easy question. What does the ECA stand for?
Well, that's really an easy one. ECA stands for Events, Conditions, and Actions. So those are the building blocks of the module, all of which provided by Drupal core since, well, I can remember actually, so forever.
Yeah, I think actions and stuff are generally were a little bit more hidden in previous versions of Drupal. But they definitely were around, that's for sure. I think they became more prominent in Drupal 8 and 9 and 10 and so on.
So I guess a more difficult question maybe is, what does ECA do?
Well, ECA is designed to be a black box operating in the background of so-called modern Drupal sites. So Drupal 8, 9, 10, and maybe hopefully soon 11 as well. It is a processor that understands a set of rules. So it jumps in every time your configured events are being dispatched, and then determines whether they need to be executed according to your Drupal site's configuration, and then run through what we call ECA models to actually take the actions if all the conditions apply. So that's all ECA does. And at the very beginning, when I introduced ECA during development to other maintainers and the community, I was always insisting in the fact that ECA itself has no UI whatsoever. It is really a black box operating in the background, having a set of configuration entities, but it doesn't really matter where those configuration entities come from. So this is a separate part. Those are UI tools. And we have designed it that way because we assume that everybody has a different flavor on how they would like to define their ECA models, so-called rules in the past. So there is a very famous UI, which is BPMN IO. That is a drag and drop interface where you can, drag your events into a canvas and then build your models based on top of the BPMN standard, which is industry independent, but it's now available within Drupal. But there is also a ECA core modeler, which only uses the form API from Drupal core, where you can have drop-down boxes where you select an event, then attach a condition to it, followed by some actions. So that's much more like the rules module was on Drupal 7, and no graphical interface to the extent that BPMN IO provides.
So we're two questions into the show. We've already mentioned the rules module, which is kind of what I expected. So I guess my next question is, in the Drupal, especially the Drupal 7 ecosystem, rules was critical for a lot of sites. Even as a somewhat advanced developer, I would sometimes turn to rules because it was just so easy to drag and drop. And if you had a more advanced team that you were working with, then they could sometimes make changes. Rules technically is available in Drupal 8 and Drupal 9, but it took a long time. So a lot of developers stopped working with it and started just kind of making their own custom modules to do similar things when they needed to. Is ECA a replacement for the rules module in your mind?
Before I answer that question, let me say that I'm a huge fan of the rules module. And I always wanted to be very, very careful about how we position ECA. So we never wanted to get into a confrontational situation like, rules or ECA and one is against the other. I used rules myself everywhere on Drupal 7 sites, and I had huge projects in the Drupal 8 world and always went back to the rules module and wasn't really feeling like it's ready to be used on Drupal 8. Although there was huge effort going into it, and I know most of the rules maintainers back then personally, we spoke to them and it felt like it's losing momentum a bit. And me and my team, ECA is not just coming from myself. There are others involved, and I hope we can mention them later too, to give them credit as well. But we spoke to these people and we thought, well, should we start helping rules to get over the finish line on Drupal 8 and Drupal 9? But our impression was that rules was amazing in the Drupal 7 world. But to migrate that over into the Symfony-based Drupal 8 environment felt like not the right approach. So that was why we started building a prototype of what is today ECA in a complete fresh environment. So yes, it is to replace rules. It has the capabilities to replace rules, but it's not against rules. So that's for me personally very important to bring that message across, because I know there have been maintainers spending their heart in that module and lots of time and so on and so forth. And I appreciate what they have done. We even had some rules maintainers from the past who joined us for our weekly meetings to give us advice, to warn us where not to make mistakes and stuff like that. But a year into development, so that was about last year in May, when we started talking officially about ECA to the community, we realized that positioning it to just a rules replacement is jumping short, I believe, because it does so much more nowadays. And I really liked when Dries started talking about helping ambitious site builders to have a better experience in building sites, because that's exactly what ECA turned into. It is a no-code solution that helps site builders actually to modify, to configure, to automate processes on their Drupal sites without writing code.
So then what are the biggest differentiators then between ECA and rules? So again, we're to kind of clear or reiterate your point, we're not trying to start a rivalry between rules. We're not trying to say one's better than the other, but it does sound like because ECA was start from scratch build, you were able to encompass some additional functionality. So what other thing? It sounds like the modularity of it is one thing, but what other things kind of stick out in your mind as different from rules?
Well, first of all, it's architecture. And we have been lucky that we started later. So we had the chance to really build it tailored towards the Symfony framework.
Okay.
And we leverage plugin managers that are already available in Drupal. So we don't have to write all the actions or the action plugins ourselves. So where the rules modules has their own plugin environment with rule actions, we just sit on top of the Drupal core action manager. So whenever there is a contrib module that comes with an action plugin, that is available in ECA without any further configuration or coding.
Interesting. That makes perfect
We
sense.
started doing the same thing for conditions as well, because there is a condition plugin manager in Drupal core, and we leveraged that as well. But we had to change direction in the middle of the development of the 1.0 release, because we realized conditions in Drupal core are not quite properly designed, if you like. The only place where they are used is in the block placement environment.
Oh, really?
And therefore, all those conditions are very specific to the block system. And that caused some confusion. So we had to start building our own condition environment. And then last but not least, the events. Well, that should be the first thing to talk about, because this is where everything starts. The events are just there in the Symfony environment, and we just listen to them. That's all we do. So we don't have to build our own framework to actually get things running. So in fact, we are just leveraging everything that's already there in Drupal. And contrary to that, Rules had to build most of that themselves, because when Rules started, those building blocks haven't been there yet.
So it feels like more of it feels closer to Drupal core and a better use of Drupal core than maybe Rules is at this point, right? And maybe it's doing a little bit more than what Rules is doing. Is that a fair assessment?
I believe so. I think we have feature parity with what Rules was capable to do in Drupal 7. And with first of all, the modern UI with BPMN IO, I think that's a big advantage, because a lot of people, from our own experience with clients, there are often in complex projects, there are stakeholders who understand their business logic, but they have no idea about a web framework, a CMS, or Drupal,
Yep.
But we can get their buy-in because they understand BPMN. They understand how business processes are going to be modeled. Yeah. So they can participate not only in building a web application, but they are on board throughout the whole life cycle of that project, of that web application. And that's a huge advantage.
Yeah. So it to me, it feels like, ECA is more of the ambitious site builders implementation of Rules, and Rules is kind of more of the developer centric implementation, right? Which is interesting, really interesting to me. We had Dries on for our 400th episode, and we talked to him about ambitious site builders and kind of what that meant, and I think this kind of falls in line with that, which is very, very exciting for me to see. I want to go back to something that you said while answering the Rules question. You mentioned my team, and I'm wondering what you meant by that. I'm assuming that there's a team around ECA. It's not just kind of you developing this in your spare time.
Absolutely. I couldn't have done it my own at all. The advent of the project was quite funny. It was Richard and myself, Richard, who lives in Spain. Him and I, we have been working on Drupal projects for about a decade already at a time. And we were tasked with a Drupal 7 migration for a global insurance company. And when we analyzed that's a kind of an intranet environment, and that was full of rules. It was probably 70% of the whole application was done with rules. So complex that it was really, really hard to analyze what they are doing and whether there are conflicting rules or stuff like that. So it was really one of the most complex applications that I had seen on Drupal 7 at the point. And everything was possible to be migrated to Drupal 9. That was, we skipped 8, so we went to 9 straight away. And rules was the only component that was missing. And Richard and I, we said, look, should we try building something around BPMN? That was the driving idea behind it. And when I raised that idea, Richard reminded me that already 5 years before then, I had this same idea already, but the client at the time didn't go for it. I really forgot about it, but now I believe during those 5 years, the idea was growing in the back of my mind. So I was just waiting for an opportunity, like a client paying for it. So we started building a prototype, showed it to the client, and they were excited and said, yeah, that's fine, go for it, build it to meet our needs, and it's okay to go open source with it. That's, by the way, something we always do when we build something for clients. We always want them to accept right at the beginning of the project to make this open source on Drupal.org, a strategy that works much better than asking them after the event. And it took us about 2 months to have a working prototype. And then we started talking on camps, and that was during the pandemic and closed down. So there were a lot of meetings on video conferences. And the funny thing was a third colleague from within Lake Drops joined in as well and helped with building it. And then something really remarkable happened. I published the first blog post about ECA, and that was on a Friday. And the coming weekend, a lot of issues were opened in the issue queue by a guy named Max Haupt. His handle is MXH. I believe he's well known in the community for being a maintainer of a lot of modules. And he raised so many meaningful questions that I was wondering, well, there is no documentation whatsoever. The kind of questions he's asking, he must have fully grasped how ECA is designed and works. So I called him on Monday and said, look, I'm really impressed about all your issues. So what's that all about? And he said, you know what? I was hired by a company in Munich. Open Campus is the name of that company. And they have a Drupal distribution for managing campuses worldwide.
Okay.
And they were just at the beginning of migrating their distro from 7 to 9, and the missing piece was the rules module. And Max was tasked to write a concept, a white paper on how to address that problem. And on that weekend, he finished writing his white paper and then found my blog post. And then he realized that he can throw away his white paper because it describes exactly what the prototype of ECA is already doing. So I said, that sounds amazing. So let's join forces. And he said, yeah, I'll talk to my boss, but why not? And so he joined the team, and he was irreplaceable. You know, his knowledge and experience, and he's a real software engineer that I'm not. And, you know, that was just great luck for ECA to have him on board. And then the fifth team member for ECA as maintainers is Ralph. Ralph is an accessibility expert and UX experienced. So he was guiding us through the process of making it as accessible to users as possible. Unfortunately, I have to admit that BPMN IO drag and drop component is not really accessible yet. That is a third-party component from a company called Camunda. They are specialized in BPMN technology, and they are working on it. So as soon as they get that fixed, we can just update the Webpack component for BPMN, and then we should be accessible all the way through. So those 5 people, it's Max, it's Richard, Daniel, myself, and Ralph. This is the team of maintainers. but we already have about 25 contributors from the community that help us with issues and, testing, helping other people. Support is a big task in the meantime, so those are helping as well. So it's a growing sub-community, if you like. So, 200 people in the Slack channel, lots of stars, and, it's moving slowly but steadily. So I'm quite pleased with that process.
It definitely feels like one of those ecosystem modules you'll see, as it starts to grow, like you'll see other modules come into play that kind of build on top of it or help to assist it. I first saw ECA in March of this year, Florida Drupal camp. Mike Herschel kind of did a little demo of it and how they were using it for Florida Drupal camp, and I was like, whoa, this is cool. I'm like, man, what kind of magic is happening in front of me? And it was cool just because like it really nicely joined that business logic to the technical requirements of it all, and they were using it to I think they were using it to automate the process of getting a session in, sending an email confirming the session had come in, and then when somebody approved that session, sending an email saying, hey, that session had been approved, and then maybe even going as far as to make that session published within the schedule or something like that. I don't know if it was that complex, but it was kind of like automating those pieces where it was kind of like, oh, like somebody doesn't manually have to do that. That's nice. Like, man, I wish like, it's great that there's a way to do that within Drupal now, and it's easy, it's drag and drop, and it makes sense. So it was very, very impressive.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most common use cases of like, we need just a simple business logic where X happens, email goes out to this role or person or something so that they can take action. Never mind all the complex ones where it's like, if this happens, change the status over here, and then like just the simple, somebody filled this out, send an email. That's not, not what
exactly. Yeah, notifications is something used everywhere.
Yep.
And it feels like there is not a go-to solution in the Drupal ecosystem overall that just addresses that. And all of those can now be done with ECA so easily. Yeah. And my colleague Daniel is always referring to the fact that ECA is so easy to use as well, because once you have it enabled on your live site, you don't have to redeploy, test, redeploy, build and redeploy a new version of your website if you want to implement a new feature. You just, in the live site, produce a new configuration of a new model, doing maybe something really simple and stupid, but you have all the tools at hand to do it right here and then, which is so much easier than writing 2 lines of code in a custom module, because then you have to go through that whole pipeline of things before it lands on your live site.
So shifting gears slightly, this module is very complex. As you mentioned, you've got 5 or 6, maintainers that are kind of working on it. It took you and another talented developer a couple of months to even prototype it. It sounds like you're in the 2nd year of development now. Over the last 2 years, what was kind of the hardest feature to implement that you had to work on?
That's a tough question. Most parts really felt simple, because in that Symfony environment, if you build your listeners, your interfaces, your classes, and so on and so forth, you have a lot of smaller building blocks, each of which is not complex on its own. The complexity only comes in if you bring all those building blocks together. So we didn't really face hard problems, even if we started like optimizing performance, like adding additional caching layers so that we can very quickly find out on a page request on a Drupal site, is there anything ECA should worry about? Because that is very important, to be as quick as possible to know, no, we don't have to do anything. So ECA, please shut up and don't do anything. So don't consume any resources. And the other way around, if there is anything to do it in the smoothest possible way. But even that wasn't hard to implement. What is probably causing the most work at this time is the forms integration, but not because it is complex in its own. To me, it's most difficult compared to other things because the forms API is not the strongest in the Drupal world. It's only arrays. And, depending on what custom modules you have, in those arrays, there can be literally everything.
Yeah.
So dealing with those unknowns can make it pretty hard. So there is often something where we have to add additional functionality to what we already have. But we can already build our own form. We cannot only modify existing forms, adding new submit or validation handlers, or adding new fields, or making fields disabled and stuff like that. We can actually build forms from scratch. So with ECA, you can make, well, I wouldn't recommend to do something like web form. In fact, web form is amazing, and there is no reason to replace that with anything. But if you have a need to build something very, very simple, you can define a route in ECA, so a path for a request which comes from outside, and then ECA responds by returning a complete build form from within ECA.
Oh, wow. That is mind-blowing. I didn't realize that you could do that. Like, yeah, that's mind-blowing. I'm impressed. Although I agree that that's probably not something that you want to start encouraging, because I imagine the amount of bug reports you'll get will explode. But in a pinch, it's good. I think the nice thing about that, it might be a good way to implement prototyping your form, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're trying to figure something out, especially for like some sort of like small A/B test or something. But yeah, I imagine that is complex.
Or maybe in an area compared to web forms where an integral part of web form is the submission, so the way how the data is being stored after the form has been filled out. But there are use cases where you don't need to store the data from your form. You just need to make decisions on how to proceed once the form is being submitted.
Oh, yeah.
So that's probably an area where it's really, really helpful.
It's interesting because I actually just got off a call for a project I'm working on where we actually don't store form data.
Mm-hmm.
Like it just gets passed along, and like the client would actually prefer that we didn't store that due to like privacy regulations and everything else.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a very valid use case. I'm wondering, right? Feels like ECA is doing a lot. It's connecting to a lot of things within Drupal. I mean, we already talked about the fact that it's sticking very close to core, as close as it can. But I'm wondering how you kind of manage performance for a module like ECA when it's subscribing to seemingly everything.
Well, there is the event subscriber service, which is available, which we leverage to do that. And we only need 2 function calls to determine if a dispatched event is relevant for us or not. So that's actually all. And I did some performance tests on complex sites. And the fact that ECA is available even with 80,000 nodes, and in our models we have 180 events that we listen to. And then we do node cloning and lots of validations and really complex things. It's not measurable that ECA is doing something. So it really behaves like if it were custom code. Because if you implement a hook for a form validate or something like that, you are executing code as well. And we have been trying to actually minimize the footprint of ECA down to almost what you would get if you wrote custom code, which was deliberate for a specific task. However, there is still some room for improvement. Like currently, we subscribe to all the events and then determine if an event is being dispatched, whether it's relevant to us. What we are planning for version 2 is to only subscribe to those events that are present in at least one of the models on a Drupal site.
Right.
Okay. That sounds harder, but way better.
Yeah. How many Drupal events are dispatched on a single page request? This is just, it's not horrifying, but the number is amazing.
There's a lot going on there, right?
Yeah.
So I imagine, and this is like not a very developer-centric view, right? But I imagine like from a performance standpoint, like ECA is more performant than if a user were to do something through the UI, right? So like, for example, you were talking about node clone and like all of that stuff, right? So like if I were a user and I went in to clone a node and there were 80,000 users doing that, right? Like ECA has got to be more performant than that exercise, I would imagine. Is that a true or fair statement?
Yeah, I tend to agree because a user also, if they do anything through the UI, it's most often a multi-step process.
Right.
And if you can move that into code and do it in a single step, that's certainly faster than anything else. I think the question there is more like, can you actually write a rule which does exactly that, what the user would do interactively?
Right.
That becomes the challenge then. You gain performance, but you have to spend a lot of minds on how do we actually formalize that in a model.
Yeah. Before we move on, you've mentioned BPMN a few times. Can we spend a couple minutes and just chat about like what is it? What does that stand for? I know it's an external standard, it sounds like, but what is it?
It's an industry standard. I actually don't know how old it is, but it's pretty mature. It's in version 2.0, and it stands for Business Process Modeling Notation. So it is a specification on how to formalize with graphics any kind of business process. So you have 3 key components. No, actually you have 4, and 3 of them are already in ECA. It is event, condition, and action. In BPMN, the action is called task, and the event also has a different name. It's not called an event, but it is actually an event. And the 4th building block is a gateway. So in BPMN, you have gateways for, like, in a developer world, you would call it a if, else if, and else statement, or a for each, or a case switch case statement. Something that
so it's a logic.
It's a logic basically.
It is, yeah. And there are different types of gateways, some of which are parallel, others are exclusive. There are inclusive gateways, and we haven't implemented them yet. You can use a gateway as, just a gate without any logic in it, but that's something missing from the implementation so far. There are more components to it. There are different types of events in BPMN. We only have implemented a single one because that's what we see in the Drupal environment. But what's notable, I think, is there are BPMN processors out there in the world. So like Camunda is one of them, and that's not an open source product. It's proprietary from their point of view. Their processor takes any kind of BPMN model and can then manage all sorts of machines, processes, and other stuff in a network that is reachable. So you would use that to actually build processes across your whole enterprise, whereas we utilize BPMN only to manage a Drupal site. So that is really just a fraction of what BPMN actually could do. So we are a BPMN process, or ECA could be called a BPMN processor, but we have to admit it is only for Drupal, and we don't aim to manage other services that are available on the network.
Okay.
Not to say that wouldn't be possible. Like, we can dispatch HTTP requests already from within ECA, and that could trigger other processes outside of Drupal and receive results from them. I know from some people are already doing that, but it would be overselling if we said we are a full BPMN processor. We are not.
Okay. So it's specialized. So it's more of a one-way street. It's more like
Yes.
BPMN can communicate with ECA, but ECA can't necessarily communicate. It's a subset.
Correct.
At the moment.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's fair.
Interesting. So earlier on, I obviously talked about my first experience with ECA at Florida Drupal Camp and how they were using it. I'm wondering how you're seeing other people using ECA, and one thing that kind of comes to mind, I'd be interested to hear if you know of any use cases of this, is like website personalization. That feels like a pretty good use case for this. But how are you seeing people use the ECA module currently?
Mm-hmm. I can talk a lot about that, driven by feedback we receive on mainly two channels, which is the issue queue on Drupal.org and the ECA channel on Drupal Slack. And I have been and still are very impressed about how quickly new users to ECA are getting to a result without the full documentation that I would like to provide. So documentation is one of those areas where we have done a lot, probably gone a new way as well. It seems to be helpful, but I personally know so many gaps that need to be filled. But still, people are able to do really impressive things with it. And they only come to ask questions if it becomes more difficult or if it's not obvious. Like if I want to validate an entity field value if an entity gets saved. Well, actually, that's not an entity event that we are looking for at this point. It's a form submit event at that point. But how can possibly somebody know that if they haven't implemented hooks before in their Drupal career? So this is something where we need to provide more hints on how people could get started. But other than that, it is amazing what people are doing with it. And as we mentioned before, notifications in all different flavors is the number one functionality that's being used by people. Scheduling is something that a lot of people are dealing with. I know there's somebody's working on a module replacement, which is not available in Drupal 9 any longer. And they had a Drupal 7 site where they have to manage, they have a platform where people can book some meetings in a calendar. And for some reason, they have a pretty complex logic to avoid overlaps. And there has been a module that did that in Drupal 7 really nicely. And they came across ECA and turned into a fan club because they were able to build that themselves. And they even picked up on the idea like, well, if you build a model to avoid conflicting meetings in a calendar, couldn't you build that model in a generic way so that the model could be shared with other users who could then build on top of that as well? And suddenly we are in the area of recipes, because that is what the recipe initiative is doing, like providing default configuration, which is then from that point on, when you start using it, it's independent from the generic one. You take it as a starting point to build your own. And that happens more and more often now.
Is that something is that something that ECA can do? Is kind of like a views import export where it can export and then import?
Yeah, that's one of the probably most powerful and surprising features. It happens very often if you write some logic, either in code or in ECA, that you have to query the database. And when it came to us that we said, okay, now we need to query the database, what do we do? And we said very quickly, well, why should we build a query builder? There is already one available in Drupal core, which is views. So we decided to leverage views. So from within an ECA model, you can call a view, take the result. You can even pass arguments to the view, take the result, and you get a list of entities in most cases. And then you can loop over that list and then process each individually.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Just to clarify my question, it was more the model in ECA and being able to export that model and import that model.
Yeah, that's built in. A model has dependency. First of all, a model is a config entity, like a regular config entity in Drupal. So you can just export that config entity.
Got it.
But on top of that, we have built an export of a complete model such that all the dependencies come with it as well. Like, if that model requires the article node type with all the fields attached to that article, it exports that as well and zips it into a tar file, which you can then share.
So it's also features.
To a certain extent, yes.
Don't sully the name of ECA with associating it with features. Okay.
Let me just say this really quick before I move on to my next question. I think config management.
About how great features is.
No.
There we go.
I think that config management is one of the best features of Drupal 8 and beyond. Right?
I agree.
I honestly think I miss that more when I'm not in Drupal than almost any other feature.
Yep.
But one thing that config management doesn't cleanly provide is a way to say, I just want this particular feature so I can transport it to another site. Like, it's not easy to say, like Jürgen was just saying, it's not easy in a current site to be like, okay, I want the article node type and all the fields associated with it and the views associated with it and ECA models associated with it. It sounds like this provides that. So if I want to provide that functionality to another site, I imagine it also handles like the UID conflicts and stuff too. But that's easier to handle. Just bundling that configuration up into a single thing that you can move to another site is extremely valuable.
Although I don't want to oversell that, because I believe Recipe will be doing that in a much better way than we can ever do. To be honest, we have built it in for support requirements, because I thought, if somebody asks a question why a model is not working as it should do, how can I reproduce that? And I said, look, let's build a very simple export button, which just gives us what we need to have a look. And well, it seems to work pretty nicely. But if we can replace that ever with a recipe feature that they provide, I tend to replace that, because it makes so much more sense to use something that somebody else maintains because that's less work you have to do.
Yeah, it makes sense. You don't want it to become the module that does everything.
I love the fact that you guys are kind of sticking to core and just like piggybacking on that. That's like that's one of the things that I always strive to do when building a site and working with Drupal, is to try to stick with core, because it feels more maintainable into the future. So it's great to hear that you guys are thinking that way.
It's, by the way, the only dependency that we come with, Drupal core.
Really?
So there is no other one.
Oh,
and that's deliberate. We want to keep that. If there is an integration that we want to provide with ECA and another contrib module, that will always be a separate contrib module on its own, so that ECA core can always stay solely dependent on Drupal core.
I think that's a good philosophy. I'm curious if it also helps with event subscriber discovery. And what I mean by that is, I'm wondering if this also helps with finding certain event subscribers. So you're saying ECA subscribes to every event subscriber. I assume it doesn't really generally create its own where none exists, except for maybe a couple of internal ones. But I remember doing some work, for example, on Layout Builder a few years ago, and needing to react to a certain action. I don't remember specifically what it was, but I remember needing to use an event subscriber and finding the right event subscriber so I could interact at the right point took a lot of effort. And I'm wondering if anybody's using ECA to just kind of see like what's available, like what event subscribers are out there.
No, unfortunately not. Every event that gets dispatched by Symfony, and Symfony dispatches also the Drupal events, we need to provide at least a small plugin on the ECA side to make it transparent to ECA. So finding available events is down to us as the ECA maintainers. And once we do that, from that point on, you're going to find all the events in a drop-down list where you can do some full text search to find from within all the available events, the one you are hopefully looking for.
Okay.
It's the other way around, which we should probably also mention. A lot of events don't yet exist in Drupal core, like pre-save entity or insert node, update node. They are still only available as hooks.
Yep.
And we have implemented events within ECA by implementing those hooks once, so that nobody else ever has to do that again. So as soon as core is hopefully continuing to work on that and providing more events replacing hooks, then we have to update ECA as well, because then the hooks won't be necessary any longer, hopefully.
Awesome. Okay, so we've been talking about all of the awesome use cases of ECA and all the things that you can do with it. I'm curious what the boundaries are. What are the kinds of things, like you mentioned, you wouldn't build a replacement for web form with it, right? And you wouldn't want to. But what are the kinds of things, if I'm looking to build a feature or working on an application, what kinds of things should I not turn to ECA for?
Everything in the front end is not really accessible to ECA processing. We've had quite a few people asking for certain things like, can I hide a form field if another field has a certain value, which purely happens in the browser using JavaScript. And you could do something with ECA, but I would not recommend doing that. So everything that happens in the front end is not really a number one task for ECA. We do support AJAX requests. So if there is anything in the UI where you want the backend to process something for you and deliver a result, that is different. That is great for ECA in a lot of cases. But everything that purely happens in the browser is not for ECA.
So just to dig into that a little bit, right? And make sure I understand it correctly. Actually, you know what? I don't think I have to dig into it because I think you explained it really well. But like basically, like if you were filling out a form and you entered a yes and you wanted a condition to happen, right? Like that wouldn't be something like you'd necessarily want to go back to the back end and have
Yeah.
ECA process. So ECA is specifically working in the back end processing stuff. Like there's no JS library component on the front end that kind of like links it other than the Ajax that you just mentioned, right?
Correct.
Okay.
When it comes to preparing a form, so when the backend builds a form before it delivers that to the front end, this is where ECA can help a lot.
Right. So validation, like you submitted the form, the backend's validating it, and then like something happens based on the
Or
validation.
or even the other side. Like if you're doing something like, what settings has this user put on their user profile? If it's these settings, show this form in these fields. If it's these settings, show this form in these fields. So you before the form loads, you can modify it.
Right.
I think another way to put it, it sounds like, Jürgen, is ECA doesn't step on the toes of conditional fields.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, that's exactly the module. I was looking for the name, and that's the one where I say I would never try. It does a great job, and why replicating something that's already there?
Exactly.
Another one which is not for ECA is the whole area of data modeling. Like if you are building custom entities, for example, that's something I would still do in a custom code, because this is, I call that a one-off task. So you are designing your data model once, you create the database tables with all their constraints, and that is something which an entity class is perfect for. In ECA, you could probably try and achieve something like that as well, but it's something that only happens once on a Drupal site. Once the data structure is being built, you never ever need that again. So that's nothing really for ECA.
You want to focus more on those repeatable tasks. Those things are like event happens, this, and this need to happen after it. And it's kind of like happening all the time or happening pretty frequently. I think that makes complete sense.
Yeah. And in that area, you asked the question about personalization before. What Nick just said about building a form depending on some user profile values, that is one area where it works really well. But there are others where it may not work as well as you expect, which is for anonymous users. If you have caching configured to the extreme, where you have high performance, which is great for your website, but the cost of that is most of the events are never dispatched because they are not needed. You know, there is no rendering layer being called, there is no form build, because that's all cached and already available. So without the events being triggered, ECA cannot do anything because it never gets started. So that's an area where caching is in the way of actually automating some things. If you really want to do that, you have to think about caching differently so that you have a chance to actually take action when it comes to the point.
Yeah.
So let me clarify something there a little bit, right? Because I'm thinking like I'm thinking of that personalization aspect, right? So, and I think I'm correct in this, but maybe I'm misunderstanding. Like you could use ECA to place a block if you had some advanced business logic that needed that block to be placed, right? So like provided, as you just said, like the page isn't like cached to infinity and beyond, right? Like as long as they're like, you could define a ECA, model that says, hey, if this person has this, and this, and does this event, show them this block, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Just reminded me that I forgot to mention that there is an ECA render module. It's a sub-module of ECA, which allows you to create render arrays from scratch on your own. So you can provide blocks, not just modifying existing blocks, you can create blocks from scratch.
Oh my God. That sounds dangerous, but really powerful.
Yeah, so creating blocks from scratch is something like I don't know. All my wheels are turning right now in so many different ways of like all the different great ways you could, and maybe not some so great ways you could use this. So let's talk about the future of ECA a little bit, right? We did talk of some of the roadmap items, but I'm wondering what's on the ECA roadmap going into Drupal 10, Drupal 11, so on and so forth.
Yeah, so the next major version will be 2.0. We are currently on 1.3. Is that right? No, it's 1.3.1, just turned it around. Yeah, the next one will be 2.0, which comes in late summer probably. And we will be making that Drupal 10 only because it's so close to the end of life from Drupal 9 that we take the opportunity to have PHP 8.1 as a minimum requirement and Drupal 10 as a minimum requirement, simply because we want to increase code quality even more and leveraging all those new PHP features and removing all the deprecations that we carry with us while we still continue to support Drupal 9. Is just such a great chance for us that we say let's do that, because the current version of ECA for Drupal 9 is so powerful. We haven't had much feature requests over the last 6 months or so, so it's really running smooth and stable. So we mentioned already gateway support, which will be implemented so that we can have inclusive and exclusive gateways to mimic if and switch case statements, which is much needed by a lot of modelers. Then a big one will be the ECA model inspector, which is, imagine you build something as a site builder and it doesn't behave as you expect. Now, how do you find out why it's not doing what you want, other than asking support? Well, our bandwidth is also limited, so we can't help everybody with those questions. So we have to build a tool for that. And the concept is already completed. So what we are going to do is we leverage Web Profiler, which is collecting data while ECA is processing each of the models step by step, collecting what tokens, variables, conditions, and so on have been available at which step in the process. Okay. And after that, we provide a UI extension to the site builder in the BPMN IO interface where they can select an event. And then the data we collected will be shown in the interface with all the contextual data which was present at the time. And then they can click through their model and find out what was the context when ECA was processing that condition or that action. And that will help very quickly a non-developer to find out why something doesn't work yet. So that is
one of the key. So it's like Xdebug for the models.
Exactly. And we called it initially, in fact, ECA debugger, until I realized and said, look, a debugger is something for a developer, but that tool should be for site builders. We can't call it a debugger, right? And so we did a survey in the Slack channel, and a lot of great suggestions came up, and model inspector, I think, was the best term that we found, and this is what we're going to call. We actually submitted for the Shark Tank, the Pittsburgh competition. So we hope to get some funding for that one.
That is another impressive feature.
Yeah, I think that will help a lot. And also some accessibility improvements by currently in the BPMN IO interface, we have a property panel, which we inherit from the external framework, BPMN.io. And that is not Drupal forms based, of course. Now, we're going to replace that property panel with Drupal forms, which will then give us the opportunity to use autocomplete and context-sensitive stuff, which means, like, at the moment, if somebody is adding an action behind a form event and they want to do some entity stuff, that doesn't really make sense at that point. You know, some actions only make sense after a very specific event. But site builders can't know that themselves. So once we have that property panel based on Drupal Forms API, we can then leverage all that stuff like hiding fields, only making available those values in a dropdown that make sense in that context, and so on and so forth. So that will be a major one. And then we have maybe something like 30 to 40 more plugins. That means events, conditions, and actions. We currently have altogether 426 in version 1. So there will be probably 10% more. And then we want to help other contrib module maintainers to integrate with ECA, because I think there is a huge field to actually grow the ecosystem.
I have a totally off topic question that I just thought about, because I want to just do everything now with ECA, but I'm wondering, like, so ECA is very tightly like coupled to Drupal, right? As far as, like, you know, being able to do, you know, the things that it does. I'm wondering, like, is it possible to build something like Zapier, right, where you have like external services interacting with Drupal, and then ECA is acting on those things and sending notifications and updating other web services and stuff like that? Like, if I didn't want to use that like pay to play solution, could I kind of build my own using ECA in Drupal?
Yes.
All right.
Just
well, short
like
answer.
that.
I like it.
Well, we can, as you can define your own routes with ECA, you can define what others would call webhooks, like, you know, an external service can call a model in your Drupal site, literally directly, if you like. And we also came across an amazing module, not very well known, HTTP client, or what is it called? HTTP request client, an amazing Drupal contrib module which allows you to pre-configure requests to external services and receive the results from them. And in combination, those two building blocks are doing exactly what you are asking for. You know, without
client manager.
That's the one. Yeah.
HTTP client manager. Okay, there'll be a link in the show notes.
I can't wait for somebody to build that thing. That's going to be exciting. Continue, Nick. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I think that's impressive. But getting back to the roadmap before I ask the last question, I'm sure one of the number one feature requests. So I figure we should say whether or not it's happening, or if it's already implemented or will never be implemented. A migration plan from rules to ECA, is that something that will ever happen, or does that already exist? Or
there is an issue for that, and I opened that myself, and I was never quite sure if I should do that or not. I think it's very ambitious trying to do something like that, and I'm still not convinced if we should spend a lot of time in trying to get there. I simply don't know how strict are rules configurations so that we can rely on them to know exactly what's coming and what we should do with them. I tend to believe it's too vague to produce reasonable results from it.
Feels like it feels like it would take more of a conscious effort to move from one to the other. It wouldn't just be like, and like based on what I've heard today, right? You'd want to like kind of do that maybe manually as opposed to trying to code a solution, right?
Mm.
I guess on a related note, I guess, do you have any plans to deal with? I mean, rules does exist for Drupal 9 and I think Drupal 10, but I think the majority of people using rules, there's I think 150,000 sites using it right now. I would guess the vast majority of those are Drupal 7 sites. And when Drupal 7 finally ends of life and people upgrade to Drupal 10, I think people kind of I think you'll see a big influx at that point in ECA. Some people will still stay on rules, some people will move to ECA. Have you thought about what's going to happen then? Because I imagine support requests are going to, I think support requests are going to spike in November. Do you have any plans, or have you reached out in the Slack channel to ask for help or prepping for that?
Well, when I spoke about a growing community around ECA before, that's now also visible around support. So
Awesome.
it now happens not too often, but more often than last week, that somebody jumps in and answers a question in an issue before I can get to my desk when I see a notification about it. So
Okay.
I'm hopeful that we invite people enough to tell them it's great to join the team and help others to get on board. That's also why I'm spending an hour or two every Friday to build in a live session ECA models where people can just join the session and ask their questions, and then we build a model to actually do what they are asking for. And what's funny is that more often there are not the complex things that are helpful. It's really the simple ones. And the feedback is amazing afterwards. Say, oh, wow, yeah, that's exactly what I had in mind, and I didn't know how to get started. And if we get more and more people to join us doing similar things, I'm hopeful that not all of those support requests come to us as the maintainers of ECA. Yep. I would love to see the maintainers team to grow as well as the contributors team to grow as well.
So am I understanding you correctly? You basically do an ECA live stream every Friday where you'll take a user problem and build it out?
Correct.
Man, that sounds like a lot of fun. I am not going to lie.
It is. And all those sessions are recorded as well and then published in a video stream. And that will be in the show notes as well, the link to that stream.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, that'll be awesome.
Awesome. Okay, so if somebody is interested in helping out either with code or maybe becoming a maintainer or helping out with support, what's the best way for them to get? What's the best way for them to help?
We currently need the most help in documentation because we have started an ECA guide, as we call it. There is a domain, ecaguide.org, which carries all the knowledge that currently exists, including the 426 plugins with their documentation and all the links to other modules. The tutorials, like the one from Mike Herschel, is on there as well. The link to the video stream is on it, and so on and so forth. But there is so much that needs to be done for that. So if anybody wanted to help with that, just contact us either in the issue queue on Drupal.org or in the ECA Slack channel on the Drupal Slack. Or you can contact me directly. That's not a problem at all. And then we can talk about who is interested in doing what and what, expertise they bring to the team as well. Like if I highlight documentation here, this is just because the area there is the one that needs the most work. But I wouldn't want to keep anyone away who is interested in helping us to develop stuff. Even though ECA is doing a lot and seems complex, each component, as I mentioned before, is pretty simple and easy to understand. So it is not the biggest challenge to join us and develop for ECA. So if anyone is interested in that, come and talk to us. We are happy to work with other people.
Well, thank you, Jürgen, for joining us. It's been an extremely informative episode. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. It's great to be here.
Do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more about this at talkingdrupal.com/tdpromo.
Get the Talking Drupal newsletter for show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choose to become a patron. Okay, now that we're at the end of the show, Jürgen, if our listeners want to get in touch with you, had any questions, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, I'm available with the handle Jürgen Haas, which is JURGENHAAS, all one word, on pretty much all the platforms, on Drupal.org, on Slack, and on Mastodon. There is still a Twitter account under that handle as well, but not very much used anymore.
And John, how about you?
You can find me on all the major social networks at John Bacozzi, as well as Drupal.org. And then you can find out about EPAM at EPAM.com.
And you can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
If you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.
See you guys next week.
Have a good one.